The gunshot that echoed through the canyon that morning in 1878 sent Violet Thompson stumbling through the scrubland of southern Arizona, her worn calico dress catching on mesquite thorns as she ran without direction, without hope, without anything except the desperate need to put distance between herself and the smoking wreckage of the stagecoach that had carried her dreams of a new life in California. Blood stained her sleeve where a splinter of wood had torn through the fabric during the attack, and her lungs burned with each gasping breath as she climbed higher into the rocky terrain, the shouts of the bandits fading behind her until there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the harsh cry of a hawk circling overhead in the merciless blue sky. She did not know how long she walked. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, and her canteen had been left behind with everything else she owned. Her tongue grew thick in her mouth, and twice she fell to her knees on the sharp stones, her vision swimming with dark spots that threatened to pull her down into unconsciousness. But each time she forced herself upright, driven by some stubborn core of survival that refused to let her simply lie down and die under that pitiless sun. When she finally saw the building, she was certain it was a mirage. The small adobe structure sat in a hollow between two red stone hills, its cross catching the afternoon light. A chapel, impossibly alone in this wilderness, with no town visible in any direction. Violet staggered toward it, her feet moving mechanically even as her mind questioned what she was seeing. But as she drew closer, the building remained solid, real, and the wooden door stood slightly ajar as if in invitation. She fell against the door, pushing it open with the last of her strength, and stumbled into the cool darkness within. The interior was simple but carefully maintained, with rough wooden pews arranged in neat rows and a small altar at the front adorned with carved wooden candlesticks. The thick adobe walls shut out the heat, and the temperature inside felt like a blessing after the burning hell outside. Violet collapsed to her knees in front of the altar, her hands clasping together automatically in the prayer position her mother had taught her as a child. The words came haltingly at first, then in a desperate rush. "Please, God, I do not know where I am. I do not know what to do. I am lost and afraid, and I have no one, nothing. Please, if you can hear me, send someone to help me. Send anyone. I cannot survive alone out here. You are not alone." The voice made her gasp and spin around, though the movement sent the chapel tilting dangerously around her. A man stood in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the brilliant sunlight outside. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out more details. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and serious gray eyes that studied her with concern. He wore the simple black clothing of a minister, though his boots were those of a man who spent more time riding than preaching, dusty and well-worn. "Forgive me," he said, his voice gentle as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I did not mean to startle you. I am Pastor Thomas, Preston Thomas. This is my chapel." Violet tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She swayed where she knelt, and suddenly he was beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "When did you last have water?" he asked, and without waiting for an answer, he moved to a small table near the altar and returned with a ceramic cup filled from a pitcher she had not noticed. Slowly. Small sips. The water was cool and sweet, and she had to force herself to obey his instruction to go slowly when every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. He waited patiently, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder to steady her, and when she had drained half the cup, he spoke again. "Can you tell me your name, Violet?" she managed, her voice hoarse. "Violet Thompson. I was on the stagecoach from Tucson to California. We were attacked this morning. I ran, I got lost. I found your chapel." Preston's expression darkened at the mention of the attack, but his voice remained calm. "You are injured." He gestured to her blood-stained sleeve. "It is nothing serious, a scratch. Nevertheless, it should be cleaned." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight easily when her legs threatened to give out. "I have a house behind the chapel. Small, but it has what we need to tend your wound and get some food into you. Can you walk?" She nodded, though in truth she was not certain. But with his arm around her waist and her own draped across his shoulders, they made their way out through a back door she had not seen and across a short stretch of dusty ground to a small adobe house that matched the chapel's construction. Inside was even more modest than the chapel itself, with just 2 rooms that she could see. But it was clean and cool, and when he helped her onto a wooden chair at the simple table, she felt tears prick her eyes at the simple mercy of being off her feet. Preston worked efficiently, bringing water and clean cloths, gently rolling up her sleeve to reveal the ugly gash that had stopped bleeding but was caked with dried blood and desert dust. His touch was careful and professional as he cleaned it, and she studied his face as he worked, noting the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy that made her feel safer than she had since the attack. "This will need stitches," he said apologetically. "I have done it before, for injuries among the few people who come through here, but I must warn you it will hurt." "I understand." Violet braced herself, gripping the edge of the table with her free hand. He was quick and neat, and though she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out, it was over faster than she expected. He bandaged the wound with clean linen, then sat back and studied her with those serious gray eyes. "Now, tell me everything." And so she did. Violet explained how she had been traveling from St. Louis, where she had lived her entire 22 years, to California, where a distant cousin had promised her a position as a teacher in a growing town. Her parents had died the previous winter, within weeks of each other, leaving her alone and with barely enough money for the journey west. The stagecoach had been her last hope, carrying the few possessions she had left, and the letter from her cousin confirming the teaching position. "The bandits came out of nowhere," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "There were 4 of them, masked, on horseback. They shot the driver before he could even reach for his rifle. The other passengers, an older couple and a man in a city suit, they all put their hands up. But I was sitting on the opposite side, and when the shooting started, I just ran. I did not think. I just ran into the desert, and I kept running until I could not hear them anymore. And then I was lost, and I did not know which way to go, so I just kept walking, and then I found your chapel." Preston listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he stood and moved to the small stove in the corner. "You must be hungry. Let me make you something to eat, and then we will figure out what to do next." "I have no money," Violet said quietly. "Everything I had was on that stage. I cannot pay you for your help." He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw a hint of a smile on his face. "Did you see a sign outside listing my prices for Christian charity? You are injured and alone and in need. That is all the reason I require to help you." While he prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Violet looked around the sparse house. There were few personal touches, just a small shelf of books, mostly religious texts, but also a few volumes of poetry and philosophy, and a faded photograph in a simple frame on the wall. It showed a young Preston with an older couple who shared his features, standing in front of what looked like a much larger church in some eastern city. "My parents," he said, noticing her gaze. "In Boston, where I grew up. That was their church. My father was the pastor there for 35 years. "Why did you come all the way out here?" The question was out before she could stop it, and she flushed. "Forgive me. That was impertinent." "No, it is a fair question." He set a plate of food in front of her and took the chair opposite with his own. I felt called to minister to those who had no access to a church. Out here in the territories, there are many small communities, ranches, travelers who go months or even years without seeing a man of God. I built this chapel 5 years ago with my own hands and the help of some ranchers from the area. People come when they can, when they need to. It is not like my father's church with its full pews every Sunday, but I believe the work is just as important, perhaps more so. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Violet felt strength slowly returning to her body with each bite. The food was simple but good, and she realized she had not eaten since the previous evening. "What will you do now?" Preston asked when they had finished. "Do you still wish to go to California?" Violet shook her head slowly. "I do not know. I have no money for another stage ticket, even if I could bear to get on one after today, and I have no way to contact my cousin to explain what happened. I suppose I could try to find work somewhere nearby, save up enough to continue the journey, but I do not even know where the nearest town is." "Porterville is about 15 miles north of here," Preston said. "It is not large, but it is growing. There might be opportunities there. I go there once a week to collect mail and supplies. I could take you there, help you get settled. You would do that? For a stranger?" His gray eyes were steady on hers. "You are not a stranger anymore, Miss Thompson, and besides, helping those in need is quite literally my calling." Despite everything that had happened that day, Violet found herself smiling. "Then I accept your kind offer, Pastor Thomas, and please call me Violet. Only if you will call me Preston." She nodded, and something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them could have named but both felt. It was not attraction, not yet, but rather a recognition of kindness meeting kindness, of two souls who understood what it meant to stand alone and keep moving forward despite the odds. Preston insisted she take his bed that night, saying he would sleep on a bedroll in the chapel, as he often did when he was working on a sermon, and did not want to disturb his own rest with pacing and thinking. Violet was too exhausted to argue much, and the simple bed with its clean sheets felt like the greatest luxury after the horror of the day. But sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the masked bandits, heard the gunshots, felt the panic of running blind through the desert. She must have cried out at some point because suddenly Preston was there, a lamp in his hand, his face concerned. "I heard you from the chapel. Are you all right?" "I am sorry. I did not mean to disturb you. It was just a nightmare." He set the lamp on the small table beside the bed and pulled the room's only chair closer, sitting down with a respectful distance maintained. "Do you want to talk about it? I keep seeing it all happen again. The attack. The blood. The running." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I have never seen anyone shot before, never seen anyone die. The driver, he just slumped over, and then the horses panicked and everything was chaos." Preston was quiet for a moment, then said, "5 years ago, when I first came out here, I witnessed a bank robbery in Tucson. 3 men were killed, including a young mother who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had nightmares for months. I questioned whether I had made the right choice in coming west, whether I was truly called to be here, or if I was just running away from the expectations of my family back east." "What made you stay?" "I realized that the presence of violence and death was exactly why I needed to be here. Someone had to stand as a reminder that there is still good in the world, still hope, still a reason to believe in something better. That chapel out there, it might seem like a foolish thing, a useless building in the middle of nowhere. but it has been a sanctuary for people more times than I can count. Travelers who needed rest, families who wanted to baptize their children, even a few weddings. And now, it was there for you when you needed it most. Violet looked at him in the lamplight, at the earnestness in his face, and felt something shift in her chest. "You are a good man, Preston Thomas." He ducked his head, almost bashful. "I try to be. We all should try to be good, I think. It is the only thing that makes sense in a world that can be so hard." They talked for another hour, their voices low in the quiet darkness. He told her more about his life, about growing up in Boston with the weight of his father's reputation always on his shoulders, about his decision to strike out west against his family's wishes, about the loneliness of his first years in the territory, and the slow building of relationships with the scattered community around the chapel. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her parents who had run a small bookshop, about her love of reading and teaching, and her dream of making a difference in the lives of children who might not otherwise have access to education. When Preston finally left her to sleep, Violet felt calmer than she had since the attack. There was something about him that made her feel safe, that made the world seem less frightening. She fell asleep thinking not about bandits and gunshots, but about gray eyes and gentle hands, and a voice that spoke of hope even in the hardest times. The next morning, Violet woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving quietly in the other room. She dressed quickly in her torn and dusty dress, wincing at how she must look, and emerged to find Preston already up and preparing breakfast. "Good morning," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face. "How do you feel?" "Better. Sore but better. Thank you for last night. For talking with me, any time." He poured her coffee into a tin cup. "I thought we might stay here today, let you rest and recover your strength. Then tomorrow, if you are feeling up to it, we can ride to Porterville." "Ride? You have horses." "Just one, but she is steady and strong enough to carry both of us for 15 miles. Her name is Patience, which I thought was appropriate for a minister's horse." Violet laughed, and the sound surprised her. She had not thought she would be capable of laughter so soon after yesterday's terror. But there was something about Preston's wry humor and kind eyes that made it possible. They spent the day quietly. Preston had work to do, small repairs around the chapel and preparation for the Sunday service that he would hold even if no one came, which he said happened more often than not. Violet helped where she could, sweeping the chapel floor and cleaning the candlesticks on the altar, grateful for simple tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. As they worked, they talked. She learned that he was 28, that he had studied at seminary in Boston, but had always felt called to missionary work, that he sent letters to his parents twice a month, but had not seen them in 5 years. He learned that she had celebrated her 22nd birthday on the stagecoach journey, alone except for the other passengers who had been strangers to her, that she could recite long passages of poetry from memory, that her favorite color was the deep blue of the sky just after sunset. That evening, they sat outside the chapel watching that very sky turn from gold to pink to the deep blue she loved, and Violet felt a peace she had not known in months, perhaps years. The terror of the attack was still there, lurking at the edges of her mind, but it felt more distant now, less overwhelming. "I have been thinking," Preston said as the first stars began to appear, "about what you said about teaching. Porterville has a school, but I know the teacher there, Mrs. Henderson, and she has been looking for help. She has nearly 40 students of all different ages and abilities, and she struggles to manage them all. If you were interested, I could introduce you, put in a good word." "You would do that? Why not?" "You are qualified, you need work, and the children of Porterville need another teacher. It seems like an obvious solution to me." Violet turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer, who had asked nothing of her except that she accept his help. "Why are you being so kind to me, Preston? You do not know anything about me except what I have told you. I could be lying about all of it." He met her gaze steadily. "You could be, but I do not think you are. I have spent 5 years learning to read people, to understand when someone is genuine and when they are not. You are genuine, Violet. You are scared and hurt and lost, but you are also strong and good and true. I can see it in you as clearly as I can see those stars up there." Something in his words, or perhaps in the way he looked at her as he said them, made Violet's breath catch. She turned away, confused by the sudden flutter in her chest, by the warmth that spread through her at his praise. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They rode out the next morning on Patience, a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes and a steady gait. Preston sat behind Violet, his arms on either side of her to hold the reins, and she tried not to think about how close he was, about the warmth of his chest against her back, about the feeling of safety that enveloped her in his presence. The ride to Porterville took most of the morning, following a trail that wound through red rock canyons and across dry washes. Preston pointed out landmarks as they went, telling her about the area and its sparse population of ranchers and miners, and the few determined farmers who tried to coax crops from the stubborn desert soil. Porterville itself was larger than Violet had expected, with a main street lined with buildings that spoke of a town with ambitions of growth. There was a general store, a bank, a saloon, a hotel, a doctor's office, and several other businesses she could not identify at a glance. People moved along the wooden sidewalks with purpose, and she saw women in calico, like her own ruined dress, alongside men in dusty work clothes, and the occasional figure in finer attire. Preston guided Patience to a hitching post in front of the general store and helped Violet dismount before swinging down himself. Several people called out greetings to him, and he responded warmly, introducing Violet as a friend who would be staying in town for a while. Their first stop was the general store, where Preston insisted on buying her 2 new dresses, undergarments, a pair of sturdy shoes, and various other necessities she would need. She protested the expense, but he waved her objections away. "Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you are settled and earning money, but you cannot very well interview for a teaching position in a torn and blood-stained dress." The store owner, a friendly woman named Mrs. Yates, took Violet into a back room and helped her change into one of the new dresses, a practical brown calico with small white flowers. When Violet emerged, she saw Preston's face light up in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You look lovely," he said simply, and she felt her cheeks warm. Next, they went to the schoolhouse, a sturdy wooden building at the edge of town with a small house attached. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a warm smile. She listened as Preston explained Violet's situation, leaving out the details of the attack and simply saying that Violet had been traveling to California but had decided to stop in Arizona instead. "Can you start Monday?" Mrs. Henderson asked after quizzing Violet on her education and experience. "I know it is sudden, but I truly am desperate for help. The pay is not much, $30 a month to start, but it includes room and board in the teacherage here." $30 a month would not make her rich, but it was enough to live on and perhaps save a little. And the room that Mrs. Henderson showed her, small but clean with a window overlooking the mountains, felt like a palace after the uncertainty of the past few days. "I accept," Violet said, and felt as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. She had a place to live, a job, a purpose. She was not lost anymore. They had lunch at the hotel, a luxury Preston insisted upon to celebrate Violet's new position. Over fried chicken and potatoes, he told her more about Porterville and its residents, pointing out various people who came and went from the dining room and sharing bits of gossip and history. "That is Mr. Daniels, he owns the bank. Honest, but a bit stiff. The woman with him is his daughter, Sarah, who I think would be close to your age. She might be a good person to befriend. And that gentleman there, the one with the silver watch chain, that is Mayor Crawford. He has been trying to convince me to move my chapel closer to town, but I like where it is." "Why does he want you to move it?" "He thinks having a proper church in town would attract more settlers, make Porterville seem more civilized." "He is probably right, but I did not come out here to build civilization. I came to serve those who are outside of it." Violet studied him as he spoke, noticing the conviction in his voice, the idealism that still shone bright despite 5 years in the harsh reality of the territory. She wondered what it would be like to have such a clear sense of purpose, to know with such certainty what you were meant to do with your life. After lunch, Preston said he needed to collect some supplies and check for mail, and that he would be a few hours. Violet took the opportunity to explore the town on her own, walking slowly along the main street and getting her bearings. She passed the saloon and heard music and laughter inside even in the middle of the afternoon. She saw children playing in the dust between buildings, their shouts and laughter a reminder of why she had wanted to teach in the first place. She was standing in front of the doctor's office, reading the sign that announced Dr. Samuel Foster's hours, when a woman's voice spoke behind her. "You must be the new teacher Mrs. Henderson told me about." Violet turned to find a young woman about her own age, with dark hair and bright blue eyes, wearing a dress that was finer than most Violet had seen in town. This, she realized, must be Sarah Daniels, the banker's daughter Preston had pointed out at lunch. "Yes, I am Violet Thompson. I just accepted the position this morning. I am so glad. Poor Mrs. Henderson has been run ragged trying to manage all those children alone. I am Sarah Daniels. My father owns the bank." She smiled warmly. "I hope we can be friends. There are not many young women in Porterville, and I would love to have someone close to my age to talk to." They fell into easy conversation, walking together along the street, as Sarah pointed out various buildings and shared information about the town and its residents. Sarah was friendly and open, talking freely about her life in Porterville, where she had lived for 3 years since moving from Denver with her father after her mother's death. "It was quite an adjustment," Sarah admitted. "Denver is a real city, with theaters and restaurants and society. Porterville is, well, it is Porterville, but I have grown to love it in its way. The people here are genuine, and there is a sense of community you do not find in larger places." "You know Preston Thomas well?" Violet asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Sarah's eyes sparkled with knowing amusement. "Pastor Thomas, of course. He is wonderful, is he not? So dedicated to his work, so kind. Half the young women in town have set their caps at him at one time or another, but he never seems to notice. I think he is married to his ministry." Something uncomfortable twisted in Violet's stomach at the mention of other young women pursuing Preston, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had known him for barely 2 days. She had no claim on him, no right to feel anything about who else might be interested in him. When she returned to the general store where she had agreed to meet Preston, she found him loading supplies onto Patience's back. He smiled when he saw her, that warm smile that reached his eyes and made her feel like the only person in the world. "Did you have a good afternoon?" "I met Sarah Daniels. She was very friendly. Sarah is good people. Her father, too, despite being a banker." He said the last part with a teasing tone that made her smile. "Are you ready to head back? We should leave soon if we want to make it before dark." The ride back was quieter than the morning journey. Violet found herself relaxing against Preston's chest, no longer self-conscious about the closeness. They talked occasionally, but there were also long stretches of comfortable silence, just the sound of Patience's hooves on the rocky trail and the calls of birds settling in for the evening. When they reached the chapel, the sun was just touching the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. Preston helped her down from the horse, his hands steady on her waist, and for a moment they stood close together, neither moving away. "I will take you back to Porterville tomorrow," he said quietly. "Get you settled in the teacherage before you start on Monday. I wish I did not have to go." The words were out before Violet could stop them, and she flushed. "I mean, you have been so kind and it has been peaceful here." "I will miss it. You can visit any time. It is only 15 miles, and I come to Porterville every week. We will see each other." His hands were still on her waist and his eyes searched her face. "I will miss you too, Violet." The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something that made Violet's heart race and her breath catch. For a wild moment she thought he might kiss her, but then he stepped back, releasing her waist, and the moment passed. That evening, they sat outside again, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Preston told her about the constellations, pointing out patterns and sharing the myths associated with them. Violet listened, not really caring about the stories but loving the sound of his voice, the passion with which he spoke about things that interested him. "May I ask you something?" she said when he paused. "Of course. Do you ever get lonely out here?" Living alone, seeing people only occasionally. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Yes. More than I like to admit. I tell myself that I am doing important work, that the loneliness is a sacrifice worth making for the sake of my calling. And I believe that truly. But there are nights when the silence feels too heavy, when I wonder what it would be like to have someone to share this with." "Someone like a wife, you mean? Perhaps. I have never really allowed myself to think about it much." Marriage requires a partner who understands and accepts this life, and that is not an easy thing to find. Most women want stability, a home in a town, neighbors, and society. What I have to offer is isolation and uncertainty, and a husband who is always putting others' needs before his own family's comfort. Violet wanted to say that there were women who might value other things more than comfort, who might see the beauty in what he was doing and want to be part of it. But she kept the words to herself, afraid of revealing too much of what she was feeling. The next morning came too soon. Violet packed her few new belongings into a small bag Mrs. Yates had included with her purchases, and Preston made them breakfast one last time in the small house behind the chapel. They were both quieter than usual, and Violet felt a sadness she had not expected at the thought of leaving this place. The ride to Porterville felt much shorter than it had the previous day. Too soon they were there, and Preston was helping her down in front of the schoolhouse. Mrs. Henderson came out to greet them, all smiles and gratitude, and showed Violet into the teacherage, chattering about the students she would meet on Monday and the curriculum they followed. Preston carried in Violet's bag and set it on the narrow bed. When Mrs. Henderson stepped out to give them a moment to say goodbye, he turned to Violet with an expression she could not quite read. "If you need anything, anything at all, send word. I check for mail at the general store every Tuesday, or if it is urgent, anyone can give you directions to the chapel." "Thank you, Preston, for everything. I do not know what would have happened to me if I had not found your chapel. You found it because you were meant to find it. I truly believe that." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "Take care of yourself, Violet Thompson." "You too, Preston Thomas." He held her hand for another moment, then released it and was gone, leaving Violet standing alone in the small room that was now her home, feeling as if something precious had just walked out of her life. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Violet threw herself into her work at the school and discovered that she loved teaching even more than she had imagined. The children were bright and eager, ranging from 6-year-olds just learning their letters to teenagers studying advanced mathematics and literature. Mrs. Henderson was a wonderful mentor, patient and kind, and they quickly developed an easy working relationship. Violet also began to build a life in Porterville. Sarah Daniels became a true friend, visiting often and including Violet in her social circle. Violet attended church services at the small church in town, led by a circuit preacher who came through once a month. She shopped at the general store and nodded hello to neighbors on the street and slowly began to feel like she belonged. But through it all, she thought about Preston. Every Tuesday, she found herself watching the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him when he came to town for supplies. Sometimes she did, and they would talk for a few minutes, always friendly but somehow distant, as if they were both holding something back. Other times she missed him, and the disappointment felt disproportionate to the situation. She told herself she was being foolish. She barely knew him. They had spent only 3 days together. It was ridiculous to feel this pull toward him, this sense that something important was waiting just out of reach, but her dreams told a different story. At night, she dreamed of his gray eyes and his gentle hands, of sitting outside the chapel watching the stars, of the moment when he had held her waist and looked at her, as if he wanted to say something but could not find the words. 6 weeks after she had started teaching, Sarah invited her to a dance at the town hall. It was a monthly occurrence, Sarah explained, one of the main social events in Porterville's limited calendar. "You must come," Sarah insisted. "Everyone will be there and it is wonderful fun. There is music and dancing and refreshments, and it is a chance to dress up and forget about the dust and heat for an evening." Violet agreed, partly because Sarah was so enthusiastic and partly because she needed a distraction from her constant thoughts of Preston. She borrowed a dress from Sarah, a pretty green thing that brought out the color of her eyes, and spent extra time arranging her hair. The town hall was crowded and loud, with a small band playing energetically in one corner and couples whirling around the makeshift dance floor. Sarah introduced Violet to what felt like dozens of people, and several young men asked her to dance. She accepted and tried to enjoy herself, but her heart was not in it. She was standing at the refreshment table, catching her breath after a particularly energetic reel when she saw him. Preston had just entered, looking uncomfortable in his minister's black, but scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. When his eyes found her, his whole face lit up, and Violet felt her heart skip a beat. He made his way through the crowd to her side. "Violet, I did not know you would be here. Sarah convinced me to come. I did not know you attended these dances. I usually do not, but I had business in town that ran late, and someone mentioned the dance, and I thought," he stopped, looking almost embarrassed. "I thought perhaps you might be here." Before Violet could process what that might mean, a young man she had danced with earlier appeared at her elbow. "Miss Thompson, may I have the next dance?" She was about to refuse when Preston spoke up. "I am sorry, but Miss Thompson promised this dance to me. Did you not, Violet?" It was not true, but Violet nodded quickly. "Yes, I did. I apologize." The young man looked disappointed but moved away, and Preston offered Violet his arm. "I hope you do not mind that I lied, but I have been thinking about dancing with you for weeks, and I did not want to miss my chance." They moved onto the floor as a waltz began, and Preston's hand settled on her waist while his other hand took hers. He was a good dancer, she discovered, leading her smoothly through the steps. I did not know ministers were allowed to dance, she said, trying to calm her racing heart. There is nothing in the Bible against it, despite what some of my more conservative colleagues might claim. David danced before the Lord, after all. They danced in silence for a moment, and Violet was intensely aware of everywhere they were touching, of the warmth of his hand on her waist, of the way he was looking at her. "I have missed you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "These past weeks, I keep finding myself starting to tell you something or thinking about what you would say about this or that. It has been lonely at the chapel without you there. I have missed you too. More than I should, probably." His hand tightened slightly on her waist. "What do you mean, more than you should?" Violet took a breath, deciding to be brave. "I mean that I have only known you for a short time, and it does not make sense that I should think about you as much as I do, that I should watch for you every Tuesday, hoping to see you, that I should feel like something is missing when you are not there." Preston pulled her slightly closer, not enough to be improper, but enough that she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "And if I told you I feel exactly the same way, would that make it more or less sensible? I do not know." "Preston, what is happening here?" The music swirled around them, and other couples moved past, but Violet felt like they were alone in the crowded room. Preston's eyes held hers, intense and searching. "I think I am falling in love with you, Violet Thompson. I have been fighting it, telling myself it is too soon, that we barely know each other, that I have no business feeling this way about someone I met only a few weeks ago. But I cannot seem to stop it. Every day I fall a little more, and I do not know what to do about it." Violet's breath caught. "You love me. I am falling in love with you. There is a difference, though perhaps not much of one. I want to know everything about you. I want to hear about your day and your thoughts and your dreams. I want to see you smile and hear you laugh and watch you teach those children you care so much about. I want all of that and more, and it terrifies me because I have never felt this way before." The music was ending, and couples around them were separating, clapping for the band. But Preston and Violet stood still, hands still joined, eyes still locked. "I am falling in love with you too," Violet whispered. "I did not want to admit it even to myself, but it is true. Preston, I think I have been falling in love with you since that first day when you cleaned my wound and gave me water and made me feel safe for the first time in so long." A smile broke across his face, transforming it from serious to joyful in an instant. "Then we are both falling together. That seems appropriate somehow." Someone bumped into them, apologizing and reminding them that they were standing in the middle of the dance floor. Preston led Violet outside, into the cool night air, away from the noise and crowd. They walked without speaking until they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to desert scrubland and the stars stretched overhead in a brilliant canopy. "What do we do now?" Violet asked. "Where do we go from here?" Preston turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I would like to court you properly. Come to visit you here in Porterville, take you to dinner, get to know you better. And I would like you to visit the chapel to see my life there and understand what it would mean if this continues, if we continue falling together. And if it does continue. If we fall all the way, then I suppose I will ask you to marry me, and we will figure out how to build a life that works for both of us." He raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "But we have time, Violet. We can take this slowly, make sure it is real and lasting. There is no rush." But even as he said it, Violet felt a sense of urgency, a certainty that this was real and lasting, that she had already fallen all the way and there was no going back. Still, she appreciated his caution, his desire to do things properly. "I would like that. All of it. The courting and the visiting and the figuring out how to build a life together." He smiled and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Violet rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and felt happier than she had been since before her parents died. Maybe happier than she had ever been. They stood like that for a long time, until the music from the town hall faded and the sounds of the desert night rose up around them. Then Preston walked her back to the teacherage, and they stood at the door saying good night, reluctant to part. "I will see you Tuesday," Violet asked. "You will see me before then. I will come to town this Sunday after my service at the chapel. We can have lunch together if you would like." "I would like that very much." He kissed her hand again, then her forehead, a gentle blessing of a kiss that made her feel cherished. "Good night, Violet." "Good night, Preston." True to his word, Preston came to town that Sunday and they had lunch at the hotel. They talked for hours, trading stories about their lives and their families and their dreams for the future. Preston told her about growing up in the shadow of his father's success, always feeling like he had to prove himself worthy of the family name. Violet told him about the loneliness after her parents' deaths, the feeling of being adrift in the world with no anchor. "You are not adrift anymore," Preston said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You have a job, a home, friends. You have built a life here." "I have you too," Violet said softly. "That is the most important part." Their courtship unfolded over the following months with a sweetness that Violet had only read about in books. Preston came to town twice a week, always finding excuses to stop by the school and walk Violet home. They had dinner together, took walks in the desert as the weather cooled into autumn, sat on the porch of the teacherage talking until the stars came out. Violet also began visiting the chapel regularly, riding out with Preston on Saturday afternoons, and staying through Sunday before returning to town. She helped him prepare for services, even when the only attendees were a ranching family from 10 miles away or a traveling peddler who stopped for rest. She grew to love the simple adobe building and the house behind it, to appreciate the quiet solitude that had initially seemed so isolating. She met the scattered members of Preston's congregation, the ranchers and miners and drifters who came through occasionally seeking comfort or guidance or simply a kind word. She saw how he ministered to them with patience and genuine care, never judging, always offering hope. And she fell more deeply in love with him with each passing day. They were sitting outside the chapel one evening in late October, bundled in coats against the cooling desert air, when Preston said, "I have been thinking about our future." Violet's heart began to race. "What about it?" "I want you to know that I have written to my parents, told them about you. They wrote back and said they would like to meet you someday, that they are happy I have found someone who understands and supports my calling." That must have been a relief. It was. "I have also been thinking about practical matters. This house is small, too small for a family. I have been planning to add on to it, build another room or two. I have saved some money, and several of the ranchers have offered to help with the labor." "A family," Violet's voice was barely a whisper. Preston turned to face her, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. "I am getting ahead of myself. First, I should ask you the most important question." He stood and helped her to her feet, then took both her hands in his. "Violet Thompson, I love you. I love your kindness and your strength and your courage. I love the way you care about your students and the way you look at the stars and the way you make me laugh. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Violet's cheeks, but she was smiling so wide her face hurt. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, Preston, more than I can possibly express. Yes, I will marry you." He whooped with joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before setting her down and kissing her for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, sweet, and full of promise, and Violet felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They were married in December, in the chapel that had brought them together. Mrs. Henderson helped Violet make a simple white dress, and Sarah stood as her bridesmaid. The ranchers who had promised to help build the addition to Preston's house all attended, along with several families from Porterville and the circuit preacher who normally led services in town. It was a small wedding but filled with joy, and when Preston said his vows, looking into Violet's eyes with such love and devotion, she felt like the luckiest woman alive. Their wedding night was spent in the small house behind the chapel, which Preston had filled with wildflowers and candles. He was gentle and patient, and Violet discovered new dimensions of love and intimacy she had only dimly understood before. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms talking and laughing, making plans for their future together. "I have an idea," Violet said, "about the addition to the house." "What is that?" "What if instead of just adding rooms for us, we made it larger, big enough to serve as a school?" Preston propped himself up on one elbow to look at her. "A school? Here, think about it. There are children scattered all over this area, on ranches and homesteads, too far from Porterville to attend school there. I could teach them here, give them the education they deserve. We could run it together, you with your ministry and me with teaching. We could serve this community in both spiritual and practical ways." She could see the idea taking hold in his mind, the possibilities unfolding. "That is brilliant. Violet, that is absolutely brilliant. We would need to plan it carefully, figure out logistics, but yes. Yes, I think that could work beautifully." They talked late into the night about how such a school might function, getting more excited with each new idea. By the time they finally fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, they had sketched out a rough plan for a school that would serve the children of the scattered ranching and mining communities, a place where Violet could teach while still living the life she had come to love at the chapel. In January, Violet gave her notice at the Porterville school. Mrs. Henderson was sad to see her go but understood, and she promised to help spread word about the new school at the chapel. By March, with the help of the ranchers and some skilled carpenters from town, the addition was complete. 3 rooms that could serve as classrooms and still provide space for Preston and Violet's growing family. The school opened in April with 7 students, children from 5 different families who were grateful for the opportunity to give their children an education. Violet taught reading and writing and arithmetic in the mornings, and Preston often joined them in the afternoons to teach history and philosophy and scripture. The children thrived and word spread, and by the end of the first year, enrollment had grown to 15 students. Violet's pregnancy became apparent that summer, and she glowed with health and happiness as her belly grew. Preston was attentive and excited, reading everything he could find about childbirth and infant care, making plans for the nursery they would set up in one corner of their bedroom. Their son was born in early November, a healthy boy with Preston's gray eyes and a lusty cry that filled the chapel house with sound. They named him Thomas, after Preston's father, and called him Tommy. Preston cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed with gratitude and love. Violet took a month off from teaching after Tommy's birth, but she was restless to return to her students. Mrs. Henderson came out from Porterville to help care for Tommy during school hours, and the arrangement worked beautifully. Tommy grew into a cheerful baby, content to sleep or play while the sounds of learning filled the rooms around him. Life at the chapel settled into a rhythm that Violet had never imagined could be hers. She taught her students and raised her son and loved her husband, and every day felt like a blessing. Preston continued his ministry, serving the scattered community with dedication and love, and the chapel became a true center of life for the area, a place where people came not just for spiritual guidance, but for education and community and hope. When Tommy was 2, Violet became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter, named Grace for the amazing grace that had brought them together. Grace was quieter than her brother, but just as sweet, with Violet's dark hair and Preston's serious expression. The school continued to grow, eventually requiring Violet to hire an assistant teacher to help manage the 23 students who now attended. The chapel itself expanded too, with Preston and several of the ranchers building an addition that could hold 50 people for services. What had started as an isolated mission in the desert had become a thriving community, and at the center of it all were Preston and Violet, 2 people who had found each other when both were lost and afraid, and who had built something beautiful together. Years passed in a blur of happiness. Tommy and Grace grew into bright, curious children who loved books and learning and the wide, open spaces of the desert. Preston's parents finally made the long journey from Boston to visit, and were delighted to meet their grandchildren and see the life their son had built. Violet's cousin from California came to visit as well, apologetic for not being there when Violet needed her years ago. But Violet bore no resentment, knowing that everything had worked out exactly as it was meant to. On their 10th anniversary, Preston and Violet took a rare day away from the chapel and the school and the children, riding out on Patience, who was older now but still steady, to the spot where Violet had first stumbled upon the chapel all those years ago. They sat in the shade of a mesquite tree and looked out at the familiar landscape. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not run that day?" Preston asked. "If you had stayed with the stagecoach?" Violet leaned against his shoulder. "I try not to think about it. The other passengers, I always wondered what became of them. But as for me, I cannot regret running because it brought me here, to you, to this life. I think about that day often. I had been feeling so lost, questioning whether I was making any difference, whether my work here mattered. And then you appeared, literally an answer to prayer, and everything changed. You gave my life meaning in ways I had not even known I was missing." "We gave each other meaning," Violet said. "That is what love does, I think. It makes us more than we were alone." Preston kissed the top of her head. "I could not have said it better myself. You should have been the minister," she laughed. "We both know I am far too opinionated for that. I would have been arguing theology with the congregation constantly. True, you are much better suited to teaching headstrong children. Though I am not sure that is actually easier." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. After a while, Violet said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" "Tommy is getting older. He has been asking questions about where I came from, how we met. I think it is time to tell him the whole story, about the attack on the stagecoach, about how frightened I was, about finding the chapel." Preston was quiet for a moment. "Are you ready to talk about that? You have not spoken of it in years." "I think I need to. Not just for Tommy, but for myself. I have been carrying it for so long, the fear and the trauma of that day. But I can talk about it now without being overwhelmed by it, because look at what came from it. Look at the beautiful life that grew from that terrible day. That is a powerful story, and I think our children should hear it. Then we will tell them together, and they will understand how precious and unexpected happiness can be, how it can grow in the most unlikely places." Violet turned to kiss him, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I love you, Preston Thomas, and I love you, Violet Thomas, now and always." They rode back to the chapel as the stars began to appear, and when they arrived, Tommy and Grace ran out to meet them, full of stories about their day with Mrs. Henderson. Violet scooped Grace into her arms while Preston lifted Tommy onto his shoulders, and they all went inside together, a family bound by love and faith, and the conviction that they were exactly where they belonged. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and challenges. The school thrived, eventually educating more than 30 children from the surrounding area. Preston's ministry expanded as well, with the chapel becoming a regular stop for circuit preachers, and even hosting occasional weddings and baptisms for families from as far as 50 miles away. Tommy grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's idealism and his mother's love of learning. He announced at 16 that he wanted to study medicine, to serve the scattered communities of the territory as a doctor, just as his parents served them through ministry and education. Preston and Violet saved carefully and sent him to medical school in California, proud beyond measure of the man he had become. Grace proved to have a gift for music, teaching herself to play the old piano that a grateful rancher had hauled to the chapel as thanks for Preston's help during a family crisis. She brought joy to the services with her playing and eventually began teaching music to the younger students at the school. When Violet was 38, she discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise after so many years. She and Preston had assumed their family was complete, but they welcomed this unexpected blessing. Their third child, a son they named Samuel, was born healthy and strong, and his older siblings doted on him. Preston's hair had begun to gray at the temples, and Violet noticed fine lines appearing around her own eyes in the mirror. But they felt young in the ways that mattered, still deeply in love, still passionate about their work, still finding joy in each day. One evening when Samuel was 5, Violet sat with Grace at the piano while the girl practiced a new hymn. Preston was in the chapel proper with Tommy, who was home from medical school for the summer, deep in discussion about medical ethics and the role of faith in healing. Samuel played on the floor with wooden blocks, building elaborate structures and knocking them down with gleeful abandon. Violet looked around at her family, at the life they had built in this unlikely place, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She thought about the terrified young woman who had stumbled into the chapel all those years ago, lost and afraid and certain her life was over. That woman could never have imagined this future, could never have dreamed such happiness was possible. Grace finished the hymn and looked up at her mother. "Why are you crying, Mama?" "Happy tears, sweetheart. Just grateful for all of you." Preston appeared in the doorway, Tommy behind him, and crossed the room to put his arm around Violet's shoulders. "What is this about tears?" "I was just thinking about how blessed we are, how far we have come." Preston pulled her close and kissed her temple. "We have indeed, and it all started with a prayer." "2 prayers," Violet corrected. "Mine asking for help, and yours asking for purpose. God answered both, did he not?" "He did, in the most perfect way possible." Tommy joined Grace at the piano, playing a simple melody he remembered from childhood. Samuel abandoned his blocks to climb into Violet's lap, his small, warm body a comforting weight. Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders, and in that moment, surrounded by music and love and the evidence of a life well lived, Violet felt the kind of peace that surpasses understanding. The years rolled on, each one bringing new experiences and new joys. Tommy graduated from medical school and returned to Arizona, setting up a practice in Porterville, but riding out to the chapel regularly to tend to the medical needs of the scattered community. He married a young woman named Elizabeth, who had been a student at Violet's school years before, and they gave Preston and Violet their first grandchildren, twin boys who inherited their father's serious nature and their grandmother's love of learning. Grace married as well, to a rancher's son named James who loved her music and supported her dream of opening a music school alongside Violet's academic one. Together, they expanded the chapel's educational offerings, providing lessons in both academic subjects and the arts. Samuel, the surprise baby, grew into a young man who combined his father's spiritual calling with his mother's teaching gift. He studied theology and education, with plans to continue his parents' work when they were ready to retire, ensuring that the chapel and school would continue to serve the community for generations to come. On Violet's 50th birthday, the community organized a celebration at the chapel. Families came from all across the territory, many of them former students of Violet's or members of Preston's congregation. There was music and food and laughter, and speaker after speaker stood to talk about how Violet and Preston had changed their lives, had given them hope and education and spiritual guidance when they needed it most. Violet was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude. She stood with Preston's arm around her waist, listening to stories she had never heard before about the impact their work had made. A young woman who had been one of her first students stood and told about how Violet's teaching had inspired her to become a teacher herself. A grizzled rancher spoke about how Preston's counsel had saved his marriage during a difficult time. A mother of 5 talked about how the school had given her children opportunities they never would have had otherwise. When it was finally Violet's turn to speak, she looked out at the gathered crowd, at the faces of people she had come to love over the years, and she felt the tears come again. "I do not have adequate words to express what all of you mean to me," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "When I first came to this place, I was lost, literally lost, wandering in the desert, certain I was going to die. But I found this chapel and I found Preston, and through him I found all of you. You welcomed me, accepted me, allowed me to be part of this community. You have been my family, my purpose, my joy. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for letting me serve you and teach you and learn from you. It has been the greatest honor of my life." Preston took her hand and squeezed it gently, and when she looked at him, she saw tears in his eyes as well. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. 22 years ago, I was questioning whether my work here mattered, whether I was making any difference at all. And then God sent me Violet, and everything changed. She showed me that our work was not just about preaching and praying, but about serving in practical ways, about educating and nurturing and building community. Together, we have created something far greater than either of us could have alone. And it is all because of you, because you believed in what we were trying to do and supported us every step of the way. Violet and I are the ones who should be thanking you for allowing us to be part of your lives, for trusting us with your children's education and your spiritual care. We love you all, and we thank God for you every single day." The gathering erupted in applause, and then someone started singing, one of the old hymns they often sang at services. Others joined in, voices blending together in harmony, and Violet leaned against Preston and let the music wash over her, feeling blessed beyond measure. As the sun set and the celebration continued into the evening, Violet found herself thinking about that terrified young woman who had prayed in this very chapel all those years ago. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that her prayer would be answered in ways she could not imagine, that the life ahead of her would be filled with more love and joy and purpose than she had ever dreamed possible. But perhaps she did not need to go back. Perhaps the life she had lived, the love she had found, the family she had built, perhaps all of that was the answer to that long-ago prayer. And what an answer it had been. The celebration finally wound down as families began the long journeys back to their homes. Preston and Violet stood at the door of the chapel, saying goodbye to each person, receiving hugs and well wishes. When the last family had departed and the chapel was quiet again, they walked hand in hand to their house, where their children and grandchildren were waiting. They spent the evening together, 3 generations gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter. Tommy told tales from his medical practice, careful to maintain patient confidentiality, but sharing the humorous and heartwarming moments. Grace played the piano while her children sang along, their pure voices filling the house with music. Samuel shared his plans for the future of the chapel and school, his enthusiasm and idealism reminding Violet so much of Preston at that age. Elizabeth, Tommy's wife, had brought a cake she had baked for the occasion, and they all sang to Violet before cutting into it. The grandchildren clamored for her attention, showing her drawings they had made and reciting poems they had learned. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. Later, after the children and grandchildren had retired to various rooms and corners to sleep, Preston and Violet sat alone in the main room, the fire burning low in the hearth. 50 years old, Violet mused. I can hardly believe it. Where did the time go? Into a life well lived, Preston said. Into love and work and family. There is no better way to spend time than that. Do you ever regret it? This life we chose. You could have had a much larger congregation in a city, a bigger church, more recognition for your work. Preston turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as clear and direct as they had been the first day she met him. Regret it? Violet, this has been beyond my wildest dreams. I have you, our children, our grandchildren. I have meaningful work that makes a real difference in people's lives. I have a community that I love and that loves me in return. What more could any man want? You are a good man, Preston Thomas, the best man I have ever known. And you are the best woman I have ever known. We are well matched, you and I. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the same heart that had been beating in rhythm with hers for over 2 decades. You remember what you said that first night, when I found you praying in the chapel? Preston asked quietly. I said I was lost and afraid. And I told you that you were not alone. It is still true, you know. You will never be alone again, Violet. I will be with you for the rest of our lives, and even beyond that, I believe. Some bonds are too strong to be broken, even by death. Violet lifted her head to kiss him, a kiss that held all the love and gratitude and joy of their years together. I know, and I will be with you too, always. They sat by the fire until it burned to embers, talking quietly about the past and the future, about their children's happiness and their grandchildren's potential, about the legacy they hoped to leave behind. It was a conversation they had had many times over the years, but it never grew old, because each time they discovered new depths to explore, new dreams to dream together. The following years brought the natural changes that come with aging. Preston's hair went completely gray, and his step grew slower, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. Violet developed arthritis in her hands, which made it harder to write on the chalkboard, but she adapted, relying more on oral instruction and having her assistant do the writing. They gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the school and chapel, training Samuel to take over Preston's ministerial duties and hiring additional teachers to handle the growing student body. But they remained involved, attending services every Sunday, visiting classrooms regularly, counseling community members who sought their wisdom and experience. Their 60th wedding anniversary was celebrated with another gathering at the chapel, smaller than the 50th birthday celebration, but no less meaningful. All 3 of their children were there with their families, and the chapel was filled with grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the newest generation of a family built on faith and love. Preston and Violet renewed their vows that day, standing in front of the altar where they had first married, their voices strong despite their age as they promised once again to love and cherish each other for all their remaining days. There was not a dry eye in the chapel, and when Preston kissed his bride, the applause and cheers seemed to shake the old adobe walls. That evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, a familiar ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, Preston took Violet's hand. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" he asked. "What is that?" "I think about all the things that had to happen for us to find each other. You having to leave St. Louis, the stagecoach being attacked at exactly the right place for you to find the chapel, me being there that day instead of in town or visiting a family somewhere. If any one of those things had been different, we might never have met. I think about that too. It seems like such an impossible series of coincidences. Or perhaps it was all part of a plan. Perhaps God knew exactly what he was doing when he brought you to that chapel door." Violet smiled. "You have always been better at seeing the hand of God in things than I am, but in this case, I have to agree. It feels like destiny, does it not? Like we were always meant to find each other." "I believe we were. You are my answered prayer, Violet, the thing I did not even know I was asking for until you appeared. And you are mine, my shelter in the storm, my home, my heart." They watched the stars come out, counting them as they had on that first night together, their hands clasped, their hearts full. Neither of them knew how many more sunsets they would see together, but they were grateful for each one, knowing that every day was a gift, every moment precious. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, at the age of 81. Violet woke to find him beside her, his expression peaceful, as if he had simply drifted from sleep into eternity. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to imagine going on without him. But she did go on because that is what survivors do. The community rallied around her, offering support and love and countless stories about how Preston had touched their lives. Samuel conducted the funeral service, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke about his father's faith and dedication and love. They buried Preston behind the chapel, in a spot with a view of the desert he had loved, under the wide Arizona sky. Violet stood at the graveside surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them living proof of the love she and Preston had shared. And she knew that, while he was gone from this world, he lived on in them, in the chapel, in the school, in the countless lives he had touched. Violet lived for 5 more years, remaining active and engaged despite her grief. She spent time with her family, told stories about Preston to anyone who would listen, and continued to attend services at the chapel every Sunday, sitting in the same pew where she had sat beside her husband for so many years. On what turned out to be her final night, surrounded by her children at her bedside, Violet was asked if she had any regrets. "None," she said firmly, her voice still strong despite her failing body. "I have lived a beautiful life filled with love and purpose and joy. I was lost once, so very lost and afraid. But I found a chapel in the desert, and I found a man who showed me what love truly means, and I found a life beyond anything I could have imagined. How could I possibly regret any of that? What do you think happens next, Mama?" Grace asked softly, holding her mother's hand. Violet smiled. "I think I will see your father again. I think he is waiting for me, just like he waited for me that first day at the chapel, and we will be together again, and it will be beautiful." She passed away peacefully just before dawn, slipping away as gently as her husband had. They buried her beside Preston, their graves marked with simple headstones that read, Preston Thomas, beloved husband, father, and pastor, his faith moved mountains. Violet Thomas, beloved wife, mother, and teacher, she found hope in the desert. The chapel and school continued to operate, run now by Samuel and his children, serving the community just as Preston and Violet had envisioned all those years ago. Their story became legend in the area, told and retold to new generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the greatest blessings, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that faith and hope can sustain us through anything. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blows across the desert and the stars shine bright over the chapel, some say you can still feel their presence there. Two souls who found each other when both were lost, and who built something beautiful that would outlast them both. Their love story, born from a prayer in a lonely chapel, had become part of the land itself, eternal and unchanging, a testament to the power of faith, hope, and love.